Okay, so over the next 4 years, the deficit is predicted to be 181 billion, and there's no screaming, there's no hysterical crying, there's no, the economy is doomed, we're all going to die because we have a debt and we're running deficits. And that change, I think, is really important and very valuable to our political discourse about budgets going forward.
One for Mum, one for Dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to dive straight into Treasurer Jim Chalmers' first budget.
I present the Appropriation Bill Number 1, 2022-23.
The government has just delivered its first federal budget, and it is all about cost of living.
Let's go straight to Budget 2022 because there is a lot to break down.
Grim outlook delivered in the first Albanese-Chalmers budget.
Jim Chalmers has delivered his first budget overnight. He's warned of soaring power bills.
The budget impacts 26 million Australians differently, so understandably, some are happy and others are disappointed.
A little bit of cost of living support, repairing the budget and building a more resilient economy.
Wages won't catch up with inflation for another 4 years.
Doesn't really splash the cash around, which of course fuels inflation.
And with high interest rates and cost of living pressures, households are expected to spend a lot less, which isn't great for business.
DIS costs are expected to increase by 14% a year.
This is a responsible budget, bread and butter budget. I commend the budget and the bill to the House.
It was billed as a bread and butter budget, and the Treasurer has spent a lot of time emphasising the global economic headwinds and inflationary pressures on the budget.
Speaker, we now confront the prospect of a third global downturn in a decade and a half. This time not a financial crisis or a pandemic, but a war driving high prices and higher interest rates.
In the budget itself, he unveiled a 5-point plan to tackle the cost of living and delivered on a lot of Labor's election promises. But what else do you need to know about the budget? To help you unpack it all, I'm delighted to introduce our Executive Director, Richard Dennis, Senior Economist, Matt Grudnoff, and Research Economist, Eliza Littleton. G'day, everyone.
Hey, Eb. Hello.
Hey. Richard, first to you, what's your overall impression of this first budget from the new Labor government?
Oh, look, no surprises in my analysis, just like there's no surprises in the budget.
It was all leaked beforehand.
It was all leaked. And look, it was a mini budget. And clearly they were saying, look, we've won office, we want to implement a whole bunch of our policies as soon as we can. We want to put them all in the context of the economy and the overall finances. So rather than announce them one at a time and everyone say, what's that going to do to the budget? They had a mini budget. They've updated all the economic projections. The strength of it is they've just rolled out all their election promises. The weaknesses is that's all they've done. And the problem, of course, is that the world's changed quite radically since when the promises were made and where we are now. We've got a war in the Ukraine, we've got record low wages falling at record pace, and interest rates rising at record pace. All the promises, fine, good, tick, but what we actually need to do is a plan to cope with the economy we've got, not just implement the promises that were made.
Yeah. Eliza, I'll come to you next. Partly, as I mentioned, this budget was just delivering on Labor's election promises, and it was kind of billed as bread and butter, kind of a no surprises type thing. So what are some of those elements? What did Labor deliver on?
Yeah, as you say, much of what was in the budget, we really knew ahead of time. So things like changes to the childcare subsidy, paid parental leave, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, more spots at university and TAFE, commitments to build more social and affordable housing, things like that. But, it is still worth examining and asking questions about whether these policies go far enough. So, for example, the childcare subsidy, it'll come in about mid next year. The subsidy is going to increase the rate from 85 percent to 90% for households with a combined income of, $80,000 or under. And the subsidy rate will taper down by about 1% with each additional $5,000 of combined income that's earned in a household. So, really great that we're making childcare more affordable. This is a great idea because Australia has some of the highest childcare costs in the OECD. But this policy really doesn't go far enough in the sense that, do we really have enough protections in place to stop providers from just absorbing the additional subsidy that's given by the government? At this stage, we don't know.
The big winners in the budget, young families with a $4.7 billion cheaper childcare package, $500 million for paid parental leave, expanding the program to 26 weeks. Cheaper medicines, slashing the Medicare co-payment by $12.50 to $30 a script. And more affordable housing, 1 million new homes over 5 years, including 20,000 affordable homes.
Matt, you were in the budget locker. How well does this budget meet the economic challenges that Australia is facing, like inflation and things like the structural deficit?
Yeah, look, we've got a lot of cost of living problems at the moment, and the problem the government faces primarily is that if it just splashed out cash the way that the previous government had, that could just add to that inflation. So it has to be more targeted and more careful about how it helps people. And it's probably done that quite effectively by targeting the prices that it has control over. So rather than just handing out cash, it's targeted and tried to decrease prices of things that it actually has. Things like, as Eliza said, cheaper childcare. That's not only good for people and families, but it'll actually lower the price of childcare, which reduces inflation. Other things they did was they made medicines cheaper. Again, that'll reduce inflation. A lot of fee-free TAFE places, that'll reduce inflation. And they also had an affordable housing package. And if that actually did make housing more affordable, and let me tell you, I have doubts about that, that would also reduce the inflation.
So, Richard, that was something that you had kind of flagged earlier this year, that rather than, for example, cash handouts to help people with the cost of living, that the government can actually control prices, essentially.
That's right. I mean, there's a lot of rules of thumb in the way we talk about economic management. And one is that interest rate policy is used to control inflation, and that fiscal policy, a lot of economists for the last 30 years, a lot of conservative politicians just don't like interventionist fiscal policy, in large part because, yes, if the government starts spending a lot of money, then that can actually create more demand in the economy and push up the price of stuff. So we kind of have this very simplistic rule of thumb. If a government spends more money, it'll push prices up. But of course, rules of thumb were there to be broken, like thumbs. And if governments target their spending well, you can spend more money and push prices down, as Matt just said. So we have to be careful not to think if the government spends more, it will fuel inflation. If the government increases the subsidy for medicines, it will literally lower inflation. If the government made childcare free, as the previous government did during COVID, had a big impact on inflation. So I think we have to kind of move the debate along, and always good to see the Treasurer listening to us. And yes, when inflation hit, we came straight out and said, hang on, there are direct things government can do. There are levers they can pull which will lower the cost of living, and now's a great time to do some of these things. And given the projections for inflation, we don't know when the war in Ukraine will end, for example, but given the projections for inflation, there'll still be time in next year's budget for the government to target spending at things that won't just help people, but will deliberately, as Matt said, lower the consumer price index. And that, if you spend a lot of money making childcare free and you lower the consumer price index, then the Reserve Bank can lower interest rates. And everyone who doesn't send their kids to childcare but has a mortgage will literally benefit from the government dropping the CPI by making medicine cheaper or childcare cheaper.
That sounds like an excellent way to do things, and I've never heard anyone kind of explain the benefits in that way either, that it's not just going to be helpful for people who have children in childcare.
Because it's not the textbook way of thinking about fiscal policy, and it's not the standard way for journalists covering budgets to think. We usually think, is this a budget for families, or is this a car key budget, or is this there's always this who's the winner.
There's one clear winner and millions of losers. The big winner is the federal purse.
And who's the loser?
The losers, and there's lots of them, households, workers who now have to deal with a twin.
When, of course, if we actually have well-designed policies, we all benefit from them. So, yeah, the idea, and the coalition were very good at this, here's the favoured group, here's the favoured electorate, look at me giving cash to them. They didn't mind getting criticised for pork barrelling. They liked it. That was the comms strategy. Look, I'm giving money to you. I'm getting criticised for giving money to you.
Yeah.
So we made it all so transactional. We've kind of forgotten what the whole point of good economic policy is, which is to actually improve the economy we all live in.
Main winner from the budget, young families.
Some help with cost of living.
Any real wage rise is being eaten up by the cost of electricity and gas.
Eliza, I want to come to you next, just while we're on those cost of living measures and how we talk about budgets. I find that budgets are often directed at families more so than literally anyone else. And so I wanted to ask you about some other groups that we don't always hear about. So what about things like, was this budget any good for young people, or in particular those on low incomes, those people who are struggling the most during this cost of living crisis?
Yeah, there were certainly policies in there that will help young people and those on low incomes. And as we've mentioned, a lot of those policies won't necessarily come into effect anytime soon, and they're not going to directly put money in the pockets of people who are really struggling at the moment. So, talking about things like the 20,000 additional uni spots for domestic students and the 480,000 new fee-free TAFE spots, the plan to build 40,000 new social and affordable houses. These are all, steps in the right direction, and they're going to potentially help with cost of living pressures down the line. But there's a lot of really missed opportunities in this budget as well. And we know that the biggest issue for young people and people on low incomes right now is cost of living. And the budget revealed that they won't see real wage growth until 2024. So these issues are not going away. And unfortunately, we didn't see direct intervention in this budget to help with the cost of living pressures of these groups. So, they could have raised the rate for income support like JobSeeker and AusStudy, things like Commonwealth rent assistance, which really would have, helped people with daily living expenses now. And, it's probably too much to expect that economic inequality was going to be resolved in one budget, especially because the government faces fiscal constraints. But there are kind of revenue-raising options available to the government that they decided not to take.
Yeah, those are really excellent points, Eliza.
And to return to that topic of debt, it's going to surpass $1 trillion Australian dollars by 2026. The interest bill alone, 1.2% of GDP.
It's a very responsible budget that seeks to show some spending restraint. Budget's in structural deficit. We inherited it in that way.
Matt, I wanted to come back to you on the structural deficit. Eliza just there was kind of mentioning there's some opportunities that the government didn't take in this budget. I know the Australia Institute has been really focused on revenue. How well did the budget, or did it, tackle that problem of the structural deficit? Well, actually, first of all, for non-economists listening, what is a structural deficit? We always just talk about it like everyone knows what it is.
Yeah, that's a great question. A structural deficit sort of takes out the business cycle. So the business cycle is the idea that the economy sometimes is growing fast and sometimes it's growing slowly, and it swings up and down, up and down. And so if you take all of that out and you just take kind of like this average growth rate, then the budget shouldn't be in deficit, and it probably shouldn't be in surplus. It should be sort of balanced at that. And so if it's a structural deficit, it means that even in normal times, we have a budget deficit.
All right. And so why is that a problem, and what did this budget do to kind of tackle that?
Well, the government's keen to reduce the budget or the structural deficit. Most governments say they are. Whether or not they're actually willing to do anything to achieve it is another question. And some of the big things they left on the table was the stage 3 tax cuts to begin with. So the stage 3 tax cuts is this huge tax cut to high income earners. About half of it goes to people earning more than $180,000 a year, and it'll cost about $250 billion over the next 10 years. And in fact, looking at the budget forecast, the stage 3 tax cuts come in 2024, we actually see income tax go down in the year that it comes out. And that's the first time it's done that since the GFC. So it's having a huge impact on the revenue that the budget actually collects.
Our position on stage 3 has not changed.
We're committed to delivering what we said we would.
When it comes to the stage 3 tax cuts, our position hasn't changed.
Richard, the Treasurer has kind of indicated that he's up for a bit of a debate on tax reform, but obviously we didn't see it in this budget. How big of an issue is this going to be going forward?
Well, it's going to be a huge issue. So, as Matt was saying, the structural deficit or the structural balance of the budget is really the government or Treasury trying to say, yeah, if the economy was kind of on a sort of steady path, if commodity prices were about average, if unemployment was about average, if interest rates were about average, where would we be at? And let's be clear, we've got record low unemployment, we've got booming commodity prices, we should be in surplus.
Yeah.
You know, by normal indicators. Not because surpluses are the most important thing in the world, but if you're ever going to be in surplus, it's when your commodity prices are at record highs and your
inflation's on the rise.
Exactly. So the significance here is not, you know, what should the budget deficit be? It's, look, we are at a really unusual point in history, and if commodity prices are at record highs, if unemployment's at record lows, and you can't get the budget into balance, when you spend an enormous amount of money on enormous tax cuts, what do you think's going to happen if commodity prices fall?
Yeah.
What do you think's going to happen if unemployment goes up a bit? So, well, you know, there's a lot of econobabble around structural deficits and things, but the point is, at this point in the cycle, you know, if you're aiming for some sort of budget balance, you'd expect to see it around now.
Yeah.
And we're kind of kidding ourselves to say we can spend $250 billion on tax cuts and deliver budget surpluses at some point soonish, unless you think commodity prices are going to rise further, unless you think unemployment's going to fall even further. It's not going to happen. Now, Jim Chalmers knows that, Treasury knows that, you know, the opposition knows that. So that's why we are going to wind up having a big conversation about revenue. You know, I was talking to Judith Sloan the other day, the economics correspondent for The Australian, well-known leftist rag that it is. And, you know, Judith, who's a good economist, you know, she agreed, look, really, at a minimum, the government needs to chop the tax cuts up and ensure that some of that enormous expense, $250 billion, can be used to help people earning below $45,000 who, as Eliza said, are seeing their real wages fall. You know, their cost of living's gone up, their interest rates are up. They're not going to get a cent in support out of the stage 3 tax cuts. So the dilemma for the government is they either chop those tax cuts up and spread them around radically differently, or they come up with an even more expensive proposal to deliver the stage 3 tax cuts as is and do something to help people whose real wages have fallen a lot. So, yeah, with high commodity prices, low unemployment, if you can't get the budget into balance now, after the stage 3 tax cuts come in, forget it.
Yeah.
Unless you've got savage spending cuts to welfare, to disabilities, to health, to education. So, you know, that's the real role of economics, isn't it, guys? We just get to tell people what the hard options are.
But they sort of end up agreeing more often than not, is Dr. Richard Dennis, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and Judith Sloan, Professor of Economics and contributing finance editor for The Australian. Welcome to...
You know, he's saying he'd done the hard yards, which reminded me a bit of going shopping and deciding that I'm not going to buy an expensive pair of shoes and thinking I've done something good. So I don't know whether about... the point is, I don't think the hard decisions were taken. More to the point, should we be thinking how we can increase government revenue and what can we do with the tax system? So
I did just want to stick with revenue for a minute, because the Australia Institute had put out some research this week and in the last couple of weeks on a couple of measures there. One, Richard, on windfall profits and just exactly how much the gas industry is raking in. and secondly around the petroleum resource rent tax, which is effectively broken. What's the significance of those two bits of research as it relates to this budget and the conversation we're having?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, for an economy like Australia, record high energy prices should be great news. The Saudis are happy with high oil prices, the Norwegians are happy with high gas prices, and we're running around going, oh no, petrol's dear.
Yeah.
We're the world's largest exporter of gas. We're the world's second largest exporter of coal. Coal and gas are at record prices. Tough times. But because it's foreign companies that own nearly all of those companies in Australia, while their revenues are at record highs and their profits are at record highs, that money doesn't stay here in Australia. They employ very few people. They pay very little in company tax. And for that reason, smart countries like the Saudis or the Qataris or the Norwegians have got taxes in place that when these commodity prices boom, their taxpayers get a large slice of it. Now, in Australia, we've got something called the PRRT, the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, which is designed to tax the sort of extraordinary profits that the oil and gas industry tend to make. It's just accidentally. Ours is crap.
How did that happen?
Year after year, what it accidentally does is collect almost no revenue from these incredibly profitable companies.
I'm looking forward to a tax one day that accidentally collects a lot of resource rents from companies.
So, cut a long story short, we estimate, our research shows that the gas industry in Australia have seen their revenues surge by between $26 and $40 billion this year, and the PRRT might collect an extra billion or so. Now, if that was Norway, for example, you might expect to see at least half of that collected. So we, for decades, have chosen, let's be clear, to not have a very good PRRT. The Turnbull government had an inquiry into it, which we participated in, because it wasn't collecting any tax.
Mm-hmm.
The inquiry concluded that it doesn't collect much tax, but that's fine. And then Josh Frydenberg, remember him? He kicked
Vaguely.
off. He kicked off another. He's the guy that thought the $5 billion Hell's Gate Dam was a good idea. The first treasurer in 80 years to get conned by the Nats. So Frydenberg started an inquiry into it, another one, which was never finished. So let's be clear, everyone knows. The oil and gas industry know. They know they pay far more tax overseas.
Yep.
Australia exports more LNG than Qatar. Qatar collects 20 times more tax than we do on their gas.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the dirty secret. It's been hidden for a long time, thanks to research like ours and others. We've dragged it into the spotlight, but that's only step one. Step two is to actually get a government to say, rather than pretend I can't afford to increase unemployment benefits, how about I go and collect a lot more revenue and spend it on things we say are important?
Yeah.
And just to be clear, that there's also a huge political debate at the moment about electricity prices. And the thing that's driving electricity prices up right now is the high price of gas and coal. And so not only are these companies not paying any tax or certainly not paying taxes on these huge windfalls, they're actually the ones driving up people's electricity prices. And so, we need to crack down on these gas and coal companies, and we can start doing that by making them pay more tax.
You're seeing Australian companies, Australian families, being absolutely battered by the international prices, which are being driven by an international war, and we're not getting the benefit from these resources. We need to be looking at that.
Well, if only we would start on that effort. And Eliza, at the Australia Institute's Revenue Summit a couple of weeks back, we talked about a range of these types of revenue measures, but the government had flagged its intention or that one of its priorities would be cracking down on multinational tax avoidance. What do we see in this budget on that?
Yeah, so again, they've delivered on another election promise and introduced some new policy around multinational tax avoidance.
And this budget makes our tax system more sustainable by making sure multinationals pay a fairer share of tax in Australia, by extending successful tax compliance programs, and by giving the ATO the resources they need to crack down on tax dodging.
So they're giving more money to the ATO to help with their compliance measures, And, estimating that they'll probably raise around 3.7 billion as a result of that. And, that's great. Absolutely, multinationals should be paying more tax, as we've talked about already. But really, in the end, this is kind of small fry when it comes to, and we put it into context next to some of the tax reforms that they plan to introduce in the future, like the stage 3 income tax cuts.
Yeah, that really is dwarfed by that, I guess.
Yeah, and to be clear, they're enforcing existing laws better, which is good, and that's right. And, well done. Should have given more money to the ATO. It's one of the few areas of government spending where you directly get more cash back when you put more in. So, which raises the question why the previous government at times cut how much money they were giving the ATO to do compliance. But keep in mind, there's opportunities here, if we want to tax Google and Facebook in quite different ways, because their business model is really quite different from traditional multinationals. And of course, fixing the PRRT or introducing a windfall profits tax, I don't think would be, on gas, wouldn't be a breach of an election promise, because they've said they want to crack down on multinational tax evasion. So, there's plenty of room there if they want. But as Eliza said, giving money to the ATO, good. But, we need new laws, not just more people to enforce the current ones.
Yeah.
Where Barnaby Joyce has been travelling around writing comments on the back of coasters or issuing press releases, we've tried to say, okay, well, is there a business case for this? Is there a level of rigour? And, where there isn't, we might have delayed some spending. And I think that's the right and responsible way to go about it.
Matt, another focus of this budget was waste and rorts. Richard's already kind of talked about the Hell's Gate Dam, and I'm sure he'll chime in on that. But how much of a focus was that in this budget, and what types of things did they crack down on?
Yeah, they went through, and there was huge numbers of line items of where they were basically reversing all these grants that went out to various states, various electorates, for all kinds of weird stuff, everything from swimming pools to enormous dams to everything in between. And
car parks, presumably.
Car parks, that's right. All the sort of stuff you'd expect a federal government to be interested in, like, parks and all sorts of stuff like that.
Infrastructure, man. It's
infrastructure, that's right. It was kind of spread out over the budget, but we're talking about, probably tens of billions of dollars in savings. And some of them were clearly just sort of bribes to the National Party to get them on over the net zero line. Some of them were designed to, shore up certain marginal electorates. And fortunately, the government's gone through and kind of reversed all the ones that hadn't started yet, and sort of recouped some of that money.
Yeah. I did just kind of want to finish with you, Richard, looking ahead, because this was pretty much a no surprises budget. And as you said, more of a mini budget. And so the next budget isn't that far away. It's only just in a few months' time in May. But there's obviously still a lot to be done and still a lot left on the table in terms of reforms. Where does the national economic debate go from here?
Look, where to from here? You're right. We'll have Christmas. And look, Jim Chalmers, Christmas will be over and he'll be working on the next budget. And the department, they'll be actually starting to think about it quite soon, which is good. That's the job. Look, the reality, as I said before, is that they've implemented the promises that they made before the war in the Ukraine, before Australia's biggest fall in real wages, before a whole bunch of problems. Let's just take a look at what happened in the UK with Liz Truss. There was a Conservative government with a budget deficit who thought, how can we get out of trouble? How about some tax cuts? And they couldn't even get the bankers of London to support it. I mean, Thatcherism. Thatcherism doesn't even work in the UK in the banking end of town anymore. And that's because, those bankers who wouldn't mind a personal income tax cut probably actually understand the risk to all of the investments they manage is greater than the extra bit of take-home pay they get. So the world has shifted. I think that's what we need to understand, that the US and indeed the UK broke from the euro with Brexit. The US is now onshoring. It is spending $50 billion to subsidise silicon chips being manufactured in the US so that they're not exposed to production from Taiwan and China. No one's talking about free trade.
Yeah.
No, it's gone.
Yeah.
We need to notice this stuff. It's gone. No one's saying, I wonder what the WTO will say. I wonder if Biden's going to get in trouble. It's gone. It's over. The UK left the Eurozone. Biden's fully embraced subsidising domestic production. The UK couldn't get tax cuts through a Conservative parliament.
Yeah.
And here we are in Australia with Labor stuck implementing Scott Morrison's tax cuts from 2018.
Yeah.
They promised to do it. That's hard for them. But the economy doesn't need it. And the bitter pill that Labor are yet to swallow is this tension between, do they want to keep their promises or do they want to be good economic managers? Politics is hard. Did Scott Morrison want to deliver a budget surplus or did he want to respond to COVID? He did the right thing.
Yeah.
Right? He did. Let's be clear. He wasted a lot of money on, Harvey Norman and other people, but it was right of Scott Morrison to abandon his commitment to something when the circumstances changed.
Yeah.
And Labor don't have to abandon their commitment for stage 3 in this week's budget or indeed even in May next year. But ultimately their job is to manage the economy they've got, not implement the promises they made.
Yeah.
And I think the key lesson here for everyone, all aspiring politicians and all current ones, is Australian politicians need to stop making promises they can't keep. If I promise to win Lotto next week, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
How much can you trust economic modelling when there's a war going on, a global economic downturn, and a world slowly coming out of a pandemic? Does it just demonstrate that making promises like $275 will be cut from your bill based on modelling that gets out of date so quickly is actually a waste of time, that it's a promise you can't possibly ever keep?
Any time a politician promises that some specific economic outcome will occur in 5 years' time, that's just silly.
Yeah.
And we need to help them. When we hear it, rather than challenging the other side to match the promise, we need to pat them all on the shoulder and say, take a deep breath, son. You got ahead of yourself.
Yeah.
We can't predict the future. Economics isn't about forecasts and modelling and costings, because economists don't know what's going to happen. So, you're right, Labor have to make some big changes to accommodate the future needs of Australia, but let's be clear, we'll never know precisely what they are. The job is to show up each day and make the best possible decisions.
With the best available evidence to you at the time.
To suit the circumstances.
Yeah.
And to give yourself more flexibility to be a good economic manager, you actually have to stop making promises about what being a good economic manager is, because those long-run promises actually get in the way of doing the job.
If I could just end on one good note.
That was a good note.
Yeah, well, something that's really good that people haven't actually talked about yet out of the budget is that we have a coalition in opposition and there is no debt and deficit disaster. Okay, so over the next 4 years, the deficit is predicted to be $181 billion, and there's no screaming, there's no hysterical crying, there's no, the economy is doomed, we're all going to die because we have a debt. And we're running deficits. And that change, I think, is really important and very valuable to our political discourse about budgets going forward.
Yeah, and to be clear, the UK and the US haven't had a budget surplus in 20 years, and they're fine. It's a uniquely Australian obsession.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but you can find all of the Australia Institute's budget analysis at our website, australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 27th of October, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. Matt Grudnoff is at Matt Grudnoff, and Eliza Littleton is at Eliza Littleton. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. You can find her at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.